If you've got a Reaper project that you want to send off to someone else to mix, you'll need to consolidate and export tracks. I'm Keith from No Label, No Producer, No Limits.com. Here's how. If you have a mixing engineer and you want them to mix your Reaper project, at the simplest level, what we want to do is send them a set of audio files, and we don't want them to have to guess at where those files start and end. So we want all the files to be the same length, start at the same place, and end at the same place. We don't want them to have to put any files in the middle of the session, like these 3 files here, for instance. Now, if all you have is some audio tracks and you don't have effects on them, it's very simple. I'll show you that first, and then we'll go into some other situations, some other things you might have to do. So here we are with a project, and I'm going to go to File, Render Export, Consolidate Tracks. Here are the options you want: Entire Project, All Tracks. Uncheck this Ignore Silence, because otherwise that's going to give us spaces where there's silence, and we don't want that. Sample rate at Auto and channels at Auto, unless you have some good reason to change them. If you need to change the sample rate for your mixing engineer, you can do that here. Consolidate to some file type that's not lossy, not MP3, please. I keep this at 24-bit depth because that's my project setting. If you have markers and regions, you can include them here. Markers plus regions. They may or may not work in someone else's DAW. I've heard that it's a bad idea to embed the tempo, but while we're here, let's note the tempo. It's 136 beats per minute down here. We'll talk about MIDI in just a bit. These are the file name wildcards. It's going to name them by the track number. The first track will be 01, the track name dash consolidated. So make sure you have your tracks named appropriately so it will make sense to the mixing engineer. Choose an output directory. I can't spell test, so that's what I got. Uncheck these options and click Process. Remember, our tempo is 136 here. Let's open up a new project and import these files and see what your mixing engineer would see. So I'm going to set the tempo for 136. And let's view the Docker here. And I've navigated to the files, and here you can see them, numbers 1 through 66. There are a few numbers missing because Reaper doesn't consolidate the bus tracks, the master tracks, of course, because those are mixed tracks. It's the individual tracks we're after here. So let's left-click on one and scroll down, hold down Shift, and left-click on the last one, right-click, and insert on a new track. Now we'll get rid of the Docker. And here you can see we've got all the tracks here perfectly lined up. You can see they're in sync, and we're ready to start mixing. Now let's talk about what you do if you have effects, automation, or MIDI. When you consolidate and export tracks, it doesn't include any effects that are on the track, and it doesn't include any automation. Now, why is this? Well, it's because we pay the mixing engineer to mix. So we want them to use their ear to make decisions about EQ or compression. We want them to use their gear when they EQ or compress or whatever. So this is about giving the mixing engineer choices. However, there might be cases in which we want to send the mixing engineer something that has a track effect on it. For instance, this vocal, it's tuned. I might want to send the engineer the tuned vocal with or without the EQ. So how do we do that? Well, we can right-click and freeze it to mono, and that will freeze both the tuning and the EQ. We could also render it to mono stem tracks as well. Or we can go into the effects section, unselect the EQ, and then render or freeze it. Then that tuning would be included in the consolidate and export. Another option is to right-click on the last effect that we want, freeze track to mono up to last selected effects. And that will include the tuning, but not the EQ. So there's plenty of ways to do it in Reaper. There's also item effects, which will be captured by freezing. So if I select this item right here and Shift E, I can add an effect just to this particular item. Freezing and consolidating this track would capture that effect. Now here's another case. This guitar track has a guitar VST on it. And let's listen to what it sounds like with the VST and without the VST. Here's with. Here's without. Now that's a case in which the effects that are on this track are integral to the sound, and I am making that decision for the mixing engineer. And the mixing engineer might not have a guitar VST that's suitable. So in that case, I would want to freeze this track. How do I do that? Right-click, freeze to stereo, because this VST is stereo. I could also render it to stereo stem tracks, either way. So freeze to stereo. Now this track will include the VST that we just heard. One more case in which we might want to send and engineer a more finished product would be in the case of keyboards. Let's take a look at this keyboard right down here. Very simple part. Okay, so this is a VST called Synthmaster, and I've chosen this sound. Now, you can't count on a mixing engineer to have the same VST synthesizers that you do, so in this case, we might want to freeze this track, and I would simply right-click and freeze it to stereo, since this is a stereo keyboard sound. So I might want to freeze that track for him, but before I do, I'm going to double it. So I'm going to Control-C and Control-V, and I'm going to freeze one of them. That would be Command-C and Command-V on a Mac. I'm going to freeze this one to stereo. And now, when I consolidate and export, I have an audio file and I have a MIDI file. I'll show you what I'm going to do. Render export, consolidate tracks. I can export MIDI as reference in an RPP file if the mixing engineer is using Reaper, or I can select this and it will export a MIDI file. So if I hit process now, what will happen is I'll get one audio file and one MIDI file. And if the mixing engineer has a VST he or she wants to use instead of the sound that I got, they have the MIDI file available. Now it's a great idea to talk to your mixing engineer and see what they want. Maybe they don't want MIDI files at all, and you send them audio files. That's probably the most likely outcome. But check with them, see what they need. Now, in most cases, if you want to send a track that has automation, freezing is fine. But in order to get volume automation, we need to render this track post-fader rather than freeze it. The reason is volume automation is basically the same thing as moving a fader up and down. So if we want to capture those fader moves, we have to do so post-fader. So in this case, we would right-click, render to mono stem tracks post-fader. And we could send that track off to our mixing engineer. If you have other forms of automation, freezing will capture them. So here it is in a nutshell. If you've recorded in Reaper and you want to send your tracks to a mixing engineer, first, name all your tracks in a way that makes sense. Second, if you have any tracks that have automation or effects that you want to keep, freeze those tracks. Unless it's volume automation, then you'll need to render that track post-fader. Then consolidate the tracks with the settings that I've shown you, and send that folder to your mixing engineer along with the tempo information. Below the video, there's more in-depth information on this subject. Now, I built this channel specifically to help independent musicians get better home recordings. So if that's up your alley, it makes sense to like, subscribe, share, and comment now so that you'll get future content. That's it for now. I'm Keith from No Label, No Producer, NoLimits.com. See you soon. Bye-bye.